Welcome to the Cultured Bumpkin. And again, this episode, we have Charlie the Brit. Charlie, thanks
Much
for coming
like the
on.
British in 1812, it is fantastic to be back.
Nice. Old humor right there. Too soon. Quick question. So on Instagram, I do a lot of, classic literature quotes and readings and stuff. And most people like it when I take British literature and put a Southern accent to it. They get a kick out of it. I get a kick out of it. I think it's fun. Because it fits. Like, it's strange how much our way of talking has been shaped by British English and British writing.
Yeah. I suppose the South is probably more like, or sort of culturally, in the 19th century, the South was more similar to Britain at the time.
Yeah, and even, in some ways, like, let's say you take a Southern redneck who can read but has no library. The only book in his house is a King James Bible. That's the only thing he reads. So that is going to shape some of the way he talks and his dynamics and stuff like that. Well, then, this is the Bible Belt.
Yeah.
Because of the English Bible of 1611.
Yeah.
And so we have a very, more so than other regions of the United States, a British style of speaking, even though it doesn't sound like it. It just, once you kind of get to hear some expressions and as you're reading it, anyway.
So, I have to say, because I just forgot that it's in the background, this is a German flag, but it's a World War I flag.
Okay.
It's an original that I found in a antique shop.
Nice.
Just in case your viewers got any strange ideas.
In case they don't know their flags.
Yeah.
Usually it's funny. Most people that get outraged, it's because you're ignorant of something, not because you actually know something. That's always
I've
funny.
got the main one over here.
Oh, nice. Now, which is this? That's just the...
That's the Union flag with the royal crest on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had someone on Instagram, some gal from over there, say something about... she's just super condescending, but you said that British was offensive. It was an offensive term. The term British is offensive.
Who said that? Were they Welsh, Irish, or Scottish?
I don't think so.
Then,
I think they were from like proper England,
right?
But even then, like if you're marching off to fight the wars and someone's like, the British are here, I don't think the Scottish guys are going to be like,
no,
how dare you. She was very hard to get along with, and I didn't know if you had heard that beyond the national thing that you had.
Yeah, you get some. So you get some Scottish people who are like uber Scottish, who don't like to be called British.
And I understand that.
Yeah, and you get, so obviously in Northern Ireland you have the Unionists and the Nationalists.
Right.
Now it's really like, it's less political now, and it's more just people who there's no one really massive IRA or UDA anymore. It's more just a sort of, it's pretty much I'm going to try and be careful, but it's not like it was in the 70s, 80s, or 90s anymore. It's not that deep. But you do get some hardliners who are like, I'm Irish, I'm not British, but then the loyalists will be like, the hardcore loyalists will be like, I'm Irish and British, it's both, and that's the point.
Right.
But yeah, I've never heard that from like an English person saying they're not British. That's weird.
Anywho, we've been going through some early English literature, and I think that it's always interesting to pause and take a look at what's historically going on around some of the writers that are coming up. Edward Spenser, William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, some of those people. What was their world looking like up to the Spanish Armada?
Yeah.
So if you want, let's chat about that a little.
Yeah, absolutely. So to start with the Spanish Armada, you kind of, the roots to the conflicts kind of start with Henry VIII and the Reformation. So after Henry VIII separated from the Catholic Church and created the Church of England, that was effectively separating England from the sort of continental political status quo.
This was 1530s sometime?
Yeah, 1530s, yeah. That he did that. So there's lots of people who like to debate whether or not he was devout Protestant or if he was a Catholic or whatever, because of course he had actually been really much praised by the Pope for writing a book in defense of the faith. And so there are some people that say he was a devout Protestant who did it for religious reasons. And I'm more in the camp that he did it more for pragmatic reasons, in that he wanted a divorce so that he could get another wife so that he could have a son to secure the succession. But either way, he did it. And then by the time Henry VIII had died, there was a lot of factionalism in court, where the Protestant hardliners and the Catholic hardliners were vying for power, and there was a lot of back and forth in his reign. There were different acts of parliament that went much further to persecuting Catholics, and then they would go back and forth. But when he died, Queen Mary, Bloody Mary, as many people know her, ascended to the throne, and she was very much a Catholic. She had actually been she'd been engaged to, I think, married Philip of Spain. And she was the first Queen Regent in English history. And this was very much not liked by a lot of the Protestants in England, and also more pragmatic people who, although they might not be, hardline Protestants, didn't like the fact that effectively by the female marrying the Spanish king, any children born of that marriage would be of the Spanish dynasty. And so you're effectively becoming a part of the Spanish Empire to a greater or lesser extent. But either way, she didn't have any children, and she died. And then Elizabeth became queen. And Elizabeth, partly because of her upbringing, she was, and the people that educated her, she was much more of a Protestant ilk. And so throughout her reign, she basically had solidified the fact that her dynasty would be, or her England would be Protestant. And so this solidified tensions between England and especially Spain, because Spain was the largest Catholic power at the time. And not only was Philip a bit jilted, because obviously he hoped to get the English crown for himself, and Mary dying stopped that from happening. But the root for the war really came from the Spanish War in the Low Countries, in what is now the Netherlands. So Spain had previously owned and controlled all of the Netherlands and the Low Countries, but they were fighting a pretty fierce rebellion against the Protestants there. And this was a horrific campaign, marshy, muddy ground with loads of difficult sieges where troops were sitting in trenches on siege lines for months at end, getting dysentery and dying and having a horrible time. And Elizabeth sent English troops to help help the Protestants in the Netherlands, mainly because the Tudor dynasty had a very long memory. And Henry VII, when he effectively invaded England and started the campaign which culminated in Bosworth Field, which we talked about before, he launched his invasion force from the Low Countries. And so Elizabeth didn't want the Spanish to control the entire southern side of the Channel, or a big chunk of it. And so she was keen to aid the Protestants in the Netherlands and support them against the Spanish. So that was one of the key drivers for Philip deciding to try and invade England. Another one was, I believe it was Francis Drake was the second person to circumnavigate the globe. And it wasn't just a voyage of exploration. In his voyage across the world, he spent his time pirating Spanish ships, setting fire to Spanish settlements across half the globe where he went. And basically, it was a massive insult to the Spanish, not only because he, set fire to their ports and whatnot, but because it proved that they weren't a complete global hegemon, in that we could challenge them at sea and in their colonies. And so those two factors of Elizabeth sending aid to the Protestants and then Francis Drake's voyage really pissed off the Spanish. And so the King of Spain decided in 1588 to set off the Armada, as they call it. It was, I think, the biggest sort of invasion fleet ever launched at that point. The king, I believe, had originally intended, the commander whose name escapes me, but had originally Santa Cruz, that was it. Originally, Santa Cruz was one of the best Spanish admirals, and he would have been perfect to lead this armada. But in spring 1588, he sadly died. And so the next in line, kind of, as it were, person to lead this expedition was the Duke of, whose name escapes me, but he this Duke was selected because he was one of the most powerful aristocrats in Spain, and he was a very, very effective administrator. So you really get in military terms, you get staff officers and you get leaders of men. This guy was a fantastic staff officer. He was a brilliant administrator. He was great for organizing food and supplies and using his politicking to sort of corral and convince his underlings to work together to form this armada.
He would have been a great number 2 for Veracruz.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, he was the Duke of Medina Sidonia.
Okay.
He was a really, really good administrator, but he wasn't a good naval commander. And he said this to the king. He basically said, I'm not fit to do this. Can you get someone else who's better at it than me? He said that he didn't feel comfortable doing it when he's going to have to rely on advice for people on everything because he doesn't know what he's going to be doing. But the king insisted that he had to do it. In fact, the guy's own mother said that he wasn't fit for command for this. But for the invasion plan, they had 2 options. One was sail direct from Cadiz and go straight to the southwest of England, land a small force, having to raise a new army in Spain to then embark in Spain and land in somewhere like Devon, Portsmouth. But the other option was to use the army already in the Netherlands under the Duke of Parma. Duke of Parma was a fantastic ground commander who had been doing rather well against the Protestants in the Netherlands. And so partly because they didn't want to have to expend money to raise another army in Spain, and partly because the king wanted to use the Duke of Parma, the plan changed to sailing from Cadiz all the way through the Channel to the Low Countries to embark this massive army and then sail from there to England. Sounds relatively simple on paper, but not only do they have to run the gauntlet of the Channel, but they also have to embark a huge army in what is effectively contested territory. France was neutral in this war, so they couldn't just embark at Calais. And so you have 2 options for embarking an army: is you use a port, they can't use Calais because it's French, or you find a place where you can have a safe anchorage because it's effectively a very vulnerable position you'd be in. So you need a place where you can anchor your ships off sea, and you need a massive amount of low draft, flat bottom boats to row into shore, pick everyone up and bring them onto the ships. Because they couldn't use any of the ports in the Rhine estuary because the Dutch Protestants were very effective at raiding any shipping in the area, and the Rhine estuary was effectively blockaded by these Dutch ships. So they settled to embark the army with draft boats, which obviously would be very difficult. I mean, if you look at, this is 1588, this kind of operation in reverse, it was a massive difficulty in the Crimea for Britain at almost the height of Pax Britannica, took weeks to disembark its army in the Crimea. And this was 1588. So embarking an army off the coast of the Netherlands would be quite a difficult feat. The Duke of Medina Sidonia said that they were embarking on the hope that they would get a miracle. I'm paraphrasing, but he was effectively saying that their plan of action is to hope that they're very lucky and that it goes to plan. As they were sailing towards the Netherlands, they had noticed that the British fleet was docked at, I think, Plymouth or Portsmouth, somewhere in the southwest. And they had an option here to effectively, before they embark this army, to go and strike the English Navy. And I'm calling it the English Navy here because this was before the Royal Navy. Yeah. They had the option to go into this port, strike the English ships, and effectively cut off the England's ability to interdict any invasion fleet. And the Duke of Medina Sidonia had been suggested this by his second in command, his lieutenants, but he decided instead, perhaps owing to his ignorance in naval affairs, to just go to the letter of his orders from the king. The king's orders were to go to the Netherlands, pick up Palma, and then go and invade England. Naval commanders historically or the best ones you tend to find, are very good at creatively interpreting orders in what could have happened here, like sort of getting the intent of what the king wants to happen and then executing it as they saw fit. But Sidonia, owing, I think, to his ignorance, decided to follow his orders to the letter and effectively didn't really see that although he was praying for a miracle, when one came, he ignored it. And then instead went to embark the troops in the Netherlands. So in terms of naval doctrine in this period, there was always a back and forth in English planning as to whether or not it would be more effective to invest in coastal defences, so forts and coastal troops, so that they could wait for an invading force to invade and then hopefully destroy that army on the beaches, or invest more in a coastal raiding force / interdiction force of ships that can then destroy an enemy invading force before it starts its invasion. Fortunately for us, we chose the latter. And you can see in this period the sort of genesis of what would later become the Royal Navy, and how what the English had done is, for all shipping that went through the Thames, pretty much every single sailor was documented with his home address, his skills at sea, his abilities to go on long voyages, short voyages. They weren't kept on a royal payroll, but it was the case of when war was imminent, they could just knock on all these people's doors, say, right, lad, you're up, get on my ship, we're going. And this is what happened, because before the Armada set sail, earlier in 1588, Francis Drake had raided Cadiz and that western part of the Spanish coast, and he had seen the armada that was amassing, and he wrote very strongly to the Queen to say, basically, the Spanish are coming, we need to prepare at sea. That being him saying, yeah, we need to think about ships, not coastal forts. And that's exactly what they did. Not only this, one thing that's quite interesting is the Spanish, their naval doctrine was effectively the same as it had been at the Battle of Lepanto earlier in that century, a massive battle in the Mediterranean, which effectively ended Ottoman expansion in that theatre, where in that battle, the doctrine was ships were used effectively as floating castles, bristling with troops, where they were designed to sail next to an enemy ship and then fire with muskets and disembark and jump onto and board the enemy ship and kill them man by man that way. This was the old way of thinking. The English at this point were moving towards what we might see as this more modern way of using ships as mobile gun platforms, really, really focusing on broadsides and cannons as opposed to closing in for close quarters combat. So whereas you would see most of the Spanish ships would be these huge floating castles with massive towers, the English ships were all battered to use broadsides and focus on using cannons. They weren't as necessarily large as the Spanish ships. They weren't designed to sail around the world to the Americas or the Philippines or wherever and, embark on conquest. They were designed as effectively a coastal raiding force, and that they were very effective in. So when the battle eventually came, the Spanish Armada was arranged in almost a crescent formation, where you had the fighting ships, the escorts, on each tip of the crescent, and the slower moving, lumbering transports were in the center. The English Navy at this point, this was probably the first time where Francis Drake wasn't actually in command. He was second in command. It was Lord Howard of Effingham, I believe, that was actually made commander of the English Navy. Like the Duke of Medina Sidonia, he wasn't an experienced naval commander. he was put into the position because of his aristocratic connections and his ability as an administrator. However, whereas Medina Sidonia basically locked himself in a room, was very much poor me, I don't know what I'm doing, Howard set to the task, and he was like, right, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what to do, but I'm going to figure it out. And also, he had Francis Drake as his second in command, who was perhaps one of the best sailors of the age. So he was in a much better position to organize and command his fleet. And so much of the Spaniards' annoyance, rather than engaging as they expected would happen, rather than the English getting close and being outnumbered and effectively destroyed man by the Spanish ships, they deployed, probably for the first time in history, in a line abreast, where rather than in a big group of ships designed to close on and outnumber a ship, they were in a long line in an attempt to use broadsides, as we would see at places like Trafalgar or even Jutland in 1916. One of the Spanish admirals, who was a much more seasoned commander, tried in vain to goad the British, or English, I must say at this point, the English ships into closing in and attacking them by sort of isolating his ship a bit further away from the main Spanish fleet, making it out to be a nice, easy target. His hope would be that Drake would, see that as a prize, try and close in, seize the ship, and he would hope that he would then outnumber Drake with his, men-at-arms on the ships. But that didn't happen. The English commanders saw that it was bait and basically stayed 400 yards away and pummeled them with broadsides. And they weren't quite as advanced as the sort of men of wars that you see in the 19th century or 18th century. So they weren't able to just sink the ships en masse like you would see at Trafalgar, but they were very effective at picking away at these Spanish ships. And that they did. It wasn't a complete overall victory. They didn't destroy the Spanish Armada in this battle, but they effectively had stopped them from landing on the south coast. So the Spanish fleet then they can't retreat back through the channel, so they go to sail north and all the way around the British Isles. But much to our happiness, the British weather played a brilliant part and wrecked many of these Spanish ships all over the Scottish and Irish coasts. And in fact, I've seen in the museum in Belfast in Northern Ireland, where they have Spanish flags and cannons displayed in this museum where they wrecked in Ireland, which is pretty cool. And the Armada, retreated in dismay and defeat, and the fleet that arrived wounded in Cadiz later that year was a shadow of the one that had set sail in the summer.
Interesting. So after they were in that first initial contact, where they kind of went deeper down the channel, were they ever still in a position to look for a landing spot and land, or were they on the run at that point?
I think they were sort of trying to see what they could do, but the seasoned commanders among them knew that it was kind of done at that point, because they'd lost their opportunity to isolate the British fleet, and they knew really that if they try it again, the same thing would happen, because they engaged at full strength. And if they found another landing point, most likely the same thing would happen again, except this point they'd be at even more of a disadvantaged position.
Interesting. Well, that's fascinating. And yes, happily, we didn't plunge back into Dark Age Catholicism and that sort of thing. I think that to me, I look at the Spanish Armada and back to Henry VIII. I also believe he was a pragmatic guy who was, like he released the Great Bible, and one of the pictures, the title page in it, there we go, has like it has him, the king, and then the people like gratefully receiving the word of God on this like etching of the title page. And then along the bottom, the Pope is laying down, like laying underneath his own feet, and then with a little hat. And on the hat, it quotes from Isaiah that says, "All flesh is grass." He was just insulting this poor Pope as hard as he could in giving them the Bible. I definitely think it was pragmatic, to your point, but also just the fact that that you guys holding them off, I think, changed the course of American history as well.
Yeah.
So I just think that's a fascinating point in history. So thank you very much for breaking that down for us.
Yeah, no worries.